This house was meant to become the largest private residence in the United States. It wasn't built for living. It was built as a statement. But instead of triumph, it brought collapse. This is the story of a mansion that was too big to survive. The estate belonged to David Siegel, a man who, at one point, embodied the American dream in its most extreme form. He wasn't a Hollywood celebrity, and he wasn't born into aristocracy. Siegel built his fortune himself, creating one of the largest timeshare companies in the country, a business generating billions in revenue year after year. By the early 2000s, his name had become synonymous with absolute financial freedom. Private jets, dozens of properties, a life without limits. None of it was spectacle. It was routine. Money had stopped being a goal. It had become a tool, allowing him to execute any idea instantly, without hesitation. And it's in that state that ambition changes scale. When comfort no longer impresses you, you start chasing something else. Magnitude. Not just a big house, but something impossible to ignore. Something whose very existence announces status and power. That's when the idea emerged. Not to build another mansion, but the largest private home in the United States. This wasn't meant to be a house for living, and it wasn't an investment property. It was meant to be a symbol, a declaration, a monument to one man's success. That's why the future residence was given the name Versailles, a name that, from the very beginning, had nothing to do with comfort or family life. It referenced absolute power, theatrical luxury, and the belief that scale itself was proof of greatness. At that moment, the estate stopped being real estate. It became a projection of its owner's ambition. Construction began without hesitation. Once the idea existed, it immediately turned into action. For this project, the usual limits didn't apply. Not in size, not in budget, not in timeline. In Florida, a construction site appeared that looked less like a private home and more like an industrial complex. The project expanded quickly and aggressively. Each new decision didn't replace the previous one. It stacked on top of it. If someone suggested adding another wing, there was no debate. It simply happened. The house wasn't growing because life demanded it. It was growing because scale made it possible. At a certain point, it became clear the mansion had no defined endpoint. There was no final version everyone was working toward. Construction moved forward on momentum alone, fueled by money and ambition. Each new floor, every hall, every corridor was added without answering a simple question. Why? During this phase, Versailles stopped being just a project. It began to take on a life of its own, demanding more and more resources and attention. The house was no longer adapting to the owner. The owner was adapting to the house. And while everything still looked like triumph from the outside, the first crack had already formed within the project. With every passing month, the scale of the estate became harder to comprehend. Once the footprint passed 90,000 square feet, the numbers stopped sounding like plans or calculations. They lost practical meaning. The house contained more space than even a large family could ever need. More rooms than could be used in a lifetime. Dozens of bedrooms appeared, multiple kitchens, a massive ballroom, a private movie theater, endless corridors and entire wings whose purpose remained abstract. Some rooms existed not for function, but for the fact of their existence. They were built to be bigger, not to be useful. The house began to resemble a city more than a home. Walking from one end to the other meant covering distances that had nothing to do with everyday life. The space no longer connected people. It separated them. The bigger the estate became, the less it felt like a place to live. Versailles was no longer a display of success. It had turned into a system that constantly demanded more than it could give back. From the outside, it still looked like luxury, but inside the project, logic was slowly disappearing. Eventually, the outside world caught up with it. While the mansion kept expanding, economic reality was shifting much faster than anyone expected. The financial crisis of 2008 became the line after which money no longer flowed as easily as before. A business that had seemed stable and nearly untouchable for years suddenly lost liquidity. The cash streams feeding the construction of Versailles began to shrink. At first, it looked like a temporary delay, a pause that could be waited out. But month after month, it became clear the situation was deeper than that. Construction slowed. Some contractors walked away. Entire sections of the mansion were left unfinished. Halls without interiors, rooms without engineering systems. A project that had felt limitless suddenly ran into the hard edge of reality. Money that once allowed for reckless expansion now demanded precision, compromise, and restraint. At a certain point, construction nearly stopped altogether. The largest private home in the United States turned into a giant unfinished shell. Marble halls never received their floors. Vast rooms stood empty. Corridors led not to life, but to dead ends. Versailles entered a strange limbo. It was too big to finish easily and too expensive to abandon. What was meant to become a symbol of absolute success turned into a reminder of how fragile the illusion of invincibility can be. During this period, the family experienced a tragedy, an event that permanently altered the emotional meaning attached to the estate. After that, Versailles was no longer just an unfinished house. It became a place that was impossible to detach from, and impossible to look at without pain. Some buildings hold memories, others hold feelings. From that moment on, the mansion was no longer associated with a dream, but with loss. Its walls stopped symbolizing power or wealth. They became a reminder that even the greatest fortunes cannot shield anyone from human tragedy. This is where the story finally changes tone. It's no longer about ambition or scale. It becomes a story about the price sometimes paid for the need to prove greatness. As the years passed, it became obvious the estate had never fulfilled its intended role. It never became a home. It never became a symbol of stability. And it never delivered the sense of victory it was meant to represent. Versailles remained trapped between two states, too large to be just a house and too troubled to be a true palace. The house revealed something simple. Excess is not the same as greatness. When a project is built for display instead of living, it eventually begins to erode the people connected to it. Versailles didn't collapse physically. It collapsed the illusion that size alone can replace substance. That's why the estate today is remembered not as a success story, but as a warning. It stands as proof that even the largest houses cannot hide mistakes, and sometimes they amplify them. In that sense, the palace truly was too big to survive, because it was never built to be a home.